then governor.
This is a PDR live streaming this Sunday morning, December 29th, 2024. We have breaking news, of course. Jimmy Carter, the 39th president of the United States, has died at the age 100. So we're going to go ahead and wait for the live stream here on NBC News, which was just streamed a little while ago, breaking the news. The news did break earlier today on Twitter, on social media, and so that's where I received the first news. A lot of the networks have not really reported on it yet. The X account on the Carter Library, as of 10 to 20 minutes ago, had not announced his death at the moment. So we were checking on social media to see whether the news was true, because earlier this year there had been a false news report that Jimmy Carter had died, had passed away, and that happened to be false. Please like our live stream and subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. This is, once again, a PDR Live this Sunday morning, December 29th, informing you that Jimmy Carter, the nation's 39th president of the United States, has died at the age of 100. So this is the NBC News reporting the death.
Old, the longest living president in American history. Our Lester Holt remembers his legacy.
My name
Old, the longest living president in American history. Our Lester Holt remembers his legacy.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
He went from being Jimmy Who to winning the White House itself, then struggled with crises overseas and a troubled economy at home. A one-term president whose time as ex-president was the longest.
Thank you all.
Among the most active in American history, becoming the first American president to celebrate his 100th birthday. James Earl Carter Jr., he always went by Jimmy, was born in small-town Plains, Georgia, growing up on a farm without electricity or indoor plumbing. He attended the U.S. Naval Academy, studied nuclear physics, worked in the nuclear submarine program. Carter married Rosalind Smith, a friend of his sister's, and she became his lifelong partner. When his father died, Carter left his military career and went home to run the family peanut farm. But he wanted something more. He got into politics, Georgia state senator, then governor.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
In the Old South, Carter was something new.
The time for racial discrimination is over.
He attracted national attention,
Would our first challenger enter and sign in, please?
but was still enough of an unknown in 1973 to appear on What's My Line? 1 year later,
I'd like to announce that I am a candidate for president.
after Watergate, the country was ready for a Washington outsider who said America deserved a government as good as its people. A born-again Christian who promised voters, "I will never lie to you."
We now have a projected winner, James Earl Carter of the state of Georgia, elected the next president of the United States.
Carter narrowly defeated Gerald Ford, becoming the first president from the Deep South in more than a century.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
He started with a common touch, an inaugural walk to the White House, a cardigan sweater to talk to the nation about the energy crisis.
There's no way that I or anyone else in the government can solve our energy problems if you are not willing to help.
He became a champion of human rights.
No member of the United Nations can claim that mistreatment of its citizens is solely its own business.
And the Camp David Accord showed Carter at his best, idealistic, tenacious, leading marathon talks between Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin, achieving a peace treaty that is still in place today. But closer to home, Carter's inexperience and his distaste for political rough and tumble became serious handicaps. And when the economy tanked, so did Carter's popularity. He seemed to blame Americans themselves.
The erosion of our confidence in the future.
He looked weak, photographed collapsing during a run. And it got worse. In Iran, scores of Americans were taken hostage.
I'm a candidate for President of the United States.
Ted Kennedy announced he would challenge Carter for the nomination. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan, prompting Carter to boycott the Moscow Olympics. Above all, the hostage crisis consumed Carter's final year in office.
Any encouraging news from Iran, Mr. President? No.
A mission to rescue the hostages ended in tragedy.
8 Americans had died, an unknown number of other Americans had been wounded.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own.
Still hoping for a second term, Carter beat Kennedy, only to face an even more formidable opponent.
I'll bring new hope to America.
Ronald Reagan projected optimism and confidence, and he didn't think much of Carter.
There you go again.
Jimmy Carter lost in a landslide. And though he finally negotiated the release of the hostages, they weren't officially freed until just after he left office. Through it all, Carter was sustained by his faith.
You were faced with some huge crises as president. Did you drop down to your knees and pray?
Often, yes. Often. In fact, I prayed more per day, per hour, while I was president than any other 4 years in my life.
And his defeat marked the beginning of a remarkable post-presidency. He established the Carter Center, committed to advancing human rights and democracy. He even got some respect from an old adversary.
You gave of yourself to this country, gracing the White House with your passion and intellect and commitment. For that, Mr. President, I thank you, and your country thanks you.
Carter built houses for the poor. He monitored elections, battled disease, and worked for peace around the world, sometimes at odds with his successors. He wrote dozens of books, and in 2002 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. An extraordinary ex-president, proud of his years in the White House.
We kept the peace. We never went to war. We told the truth. Never lied to the American people, never misled the American people. So in general terms, I feel perfectly at ease with my term.
Carter was diagnosed with cancer, determined to beat it while maintaining his typical collected demeanor.
I think I have been as blessed as any human being in the world. Everything's been a blessing for me. So I'm thankful and hopeful.
Despite the diagnosis, he continued building houses alongside Rosalind and marked their 75th wedding anniversary in 2021.
75 years, I can't predict.
Rosalind died 2 years later, marking the longest presidential marriage in history. In 2024, Carter marked another milestone, his 100th birthday, with an outpouring of gratitude for his life of service. He brought that devotion to everything he did for family and for country until the end.
Our Lester Holt remembering Jimmy Carter. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, who is joining us now on the phone. She knew the former president. And Andrea, you saw so much of his life and legacy there. Surrounded by family, the Carter Center says he died at...
So, see if I can... So this is the news here on the Atlanta Journal Constitution, and so they broke the news as well that he had passed away at the age of 100. So his son confirmed that the death at his home in Plains, Georgia, said it happened around 3:45 p.m. That would be Eastern Standard Time. So it's almost exactly like an hour ago. because over here on the West Coast, Pacific Standard Time is 1:45 at the moment. It's a 3-hour difference from Eastern Standard Time. So that was a pretty good, pretty decent summary breakdown of the major events. One area when I was listening to the historical summary of how he became president and his post-presidency was the stagflation was one of the economic issues that was happening at the time of his presidency. So what happened is that there was a rise in inflation and stagnation at the time, which was kind of peculiar. Usually that doesn't happen. The issues also around with the Federal Reserve rate and their policies towards interest rates also had an effect on the election. I believe the Fed chairman at the time was Paul Volcker. I might be mistaken. So, and the October surprise, of course, the Iranian hostage situation, the situation in Iran had happened. The other thing that they didn't really go into was that the Shah had been the dictator of Iran since the U.S. helped overthrow the democratically elected president of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953. They helped the British overthrow him. And the reason that they wanted him overthrown was because he had nationalized the oil interests that were controlled by the British at the time. And so the CIA came in and helped overthrow Mossadegh, and they reinstalled the Shah of Iran. And he ruled from 1953 to 1979. I believe in 1979 he fell ill and had cancer and went to the U.S. for treatment. And while he was here in the U.S., there was an uprising in the streets of Iran. The Ayatollah at the time, I believe, was in France, and right around the time of the revolution, he flew back to Iran, and that's really what kind of led to the hostage crisis in the American embassy in Iran. So the mainstream media, of course, they're not going to go into that history because really, people complain in the U.S. about, look at the Iran, there are these crazy Ayatollahs, these crazy Muslim people, these Shiite clerics. But if you look back at the history, the U.S. is responsible for that, because had they not meddled in the internal affairs of Iran back in the 50s, that probably would have been avoided. It would not have happened. Iran today would be a democracy. Instead, they installed a dictator who ran that country with an iron fist from 1953 to 1979, 26 years. And and he was considered an ally of the U.S. So really, the U.S. has itself to blame for what's going on in the Middle East. You look at the recent invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the intervention in Libya, how things are really topsy-turvy in that part of the world, but it's really U.S. policy. It's what's really pushing a lot of that instability in that region. But of course, they're not going to get into that. Another foreign policy legacy of his, of course, is when he brokered a deal in Camp David between Egypt and Israel, and they went over there in the NBC history summary. There, Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt at the time, and I think they said Ben Gurion was the prime minister of Israel. So they had signed a peace accord, and that peace has been in effect since the late 70s. Of course, that really led to the assassination of Anwar Sadat at a military parade there. But so that was pretty tragic. I believe the Muslim Brotherhood was behind that assassination, but I might be mistaken there. So he was viewed at the time when he was president. A lot of people don't know this, as a centrist Democrat. He was really not a progressive. He did not come from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and really his period in the presidency from 1977 to 1981 really marked the transition of the Democratic Party from a more progressive party to a more centrist party. Because after Carter, you had 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush, and then Bill Clinton came in, and that marked the end of the Democratic Party pretty much representing the interests of working people. As many of you well know, Bill Clinton helped sign NAFTA, which was negotiated during the Bush administration between Bush, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico at the time. So his period in the presidency for the Democratic Party really kind of marked a transition of a movement away from the working class. His presidency, if I recall correctly, was more focused on balancing the budget than on really focusing on domestic programs like Medicare, Medicaid, helping the poor get out of poverty. And that's the reason why Edward Kennedy, challenged him for the nomination in the Democratic presidential primaries in 1980 and almost won. But that didn't happen. So that really kind of marked the weakness in his presidency. And he had been chosen, if you look back in history in the Democratic Party, since the 60s, they nominated Kennedy, LBJ. After LBJ, he quit, and then Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, who was kind of considered a liberal at the time. He was pro-civil rights in the late 40s, helped push a civil rights plank in the Democratic Party in the 1948 Democratic National Convention. But 68 was a turning point for the Democratic Party because he saw the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who was trying to run in the primaries, competing against Eugene McCarthy, and he was trying to get the nomination from the White House. Back then, you really didn't have a more open Democratic primary system. The delegates pretty much were in charge of the Democratic Party brokers. The establishment was pretty much in charge of who they were going to nominate. The primaries at the time was kind of like a testing ground for candidates, and maybe you could find a dark horse candidate if you found a candidate who did well in the primaries. So unfortunately for Kennedy, he was assassinated after the California primaries in 65, and Eugene McCarthy was not really the best alternative for the left wing of the Democratic Party. So Hubert Humphrey pretty much won the nomination and barely lost the presidency to Richard Nixon. After 68, the Democrats went more to the left and nominated George McGovern, and he was beaten in a landslide by Nixon. It's always difficult to defeat an incumbent president, and that's really what happened with George McGovern. So since McGovern, the Democratic Party has really not nominated a more liberal, more progressive candidate. He was the last progressive candidate that the Democratic Party nominated. So that was 52 years ago. Like I said before, Jimmy Carter was not a progressive when he was president. He became a progressive after he left the presidency. There was nothing progressive about him during his presidency. So, and then you look at the other candidates, and after Carter lost, the Mondale, Dukakis, Bill Clinton, of course, Al Gore, John Kerry, Barack Obama. So Clinton and Obama tried to present themselves as a progressive candidates, but when they came into office, they were not progressive at all. And of course, after Obama, you had Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden. So really, George McGovern you look at that long list that I just described for you, George McGovern was the last progressive candidate that the Democratic Party put forward in the presidential elections, and that was back in 1972. So my parents, when they came to this country, Nixon was being impeached, and really when they came to this country, Jimmy Carter was the first president that they got to see, win the presidency, assume office, and complete his term. So he was the very first president. He was referred to as a peanut farmer. He was the governor of Georgia at the time, and he came on board in Washington, D.C. post the Watergate scandal. A lot of people, the Watergate really was, the public's perception of Washington really took a big hit. After three events, well, four if you count the Pentagon Papers: the JFK assassination, the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, of course, and the Watergate scandal. Those four things, I think they really impacted negatively the public's perception of Washington as being corrupt. Whereas before, people had a more positive image, or at least perceived to be a positive image of Washington, D.C. So with the Watergate, it was just a constitutional crisis, if you read about the entire history. So, and the president had not only resigned, he was going to be impeached. He was charged with impeachment by the House and was going to be referred to trial to the Senate, but then he resigned. He not only did he resign, but his vice president, Spiro Agnew, also resigned for, believe it's for tax evasion. And Spiro Agnew, if I'm not mistaken, was the former governor of Maryland at the time. I might be mistaken there. But yeah, so there was a mistrust in Washington was at a high back then. And so the country was, the Democrats picked really somebody who was not of Washington, and he was a governor of the state of Georgia. So if you just tuned in, please like the live stream and subscribe to our channel. The breaking news right now is that Jimmy Carter, the 39th U.S. President of the United States, has died at the age of 100. His wife passed away last year, and she had been diagnosed with dementia. And I think he was diagnosed as well with that really fatal disease. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this article and then wrap it up here. But and I'm going to go ahead and use this iPad here because I'm nearsighted, so I don't really want to get close to the oh, there's another one, another article that just came out here, but I think it's this one here. So it says here that Carter, who lived longer than any president, entered home hospice care in Plains, Georgia in February 2023 after a series of short hospital stays. The only Georgian ever elected to the White House, Carter left office after a single term that was highlighted by forging peace between Israel and Egypt, but was overshadowed by the Iran hostage crisis. In the decades after, his reputation grew through his wife and wife Rosalind Carter's work at the Carter Center in Atlanta, and his philanthropic causes such as the Habitat for Humanity and so forth. So, and then it gives you here a little bit of his history right there, where he was born in Plains on October 1st, 1924. We just celebrated his 100th, but the country celebrated his 100th birthday a couple of months ago, or they acknowledged it there. So, and then he is known for this as well, that on his inauguration day, rather than driving past the crowds in an armored limousine, Jimmy and Rosalind emerged from the car with their daughter Amy at their side, and walked down Pennsylvania Avenue, holding hands and waving. And by the way, if I'm not mistaken, Bill Clinton also reintroduced that tradition, the just walking out of the limousine and walking towards the rest of the inauguration. I don't think they do that anymore because of concerns of their safety. And I don't know if Barack Obama did. Maybe he did do that, stepping out of the vehicle and walking. But I do remember that Bill Clinton had done that exact same thing. And Carter's successes included promoting human rights, adding to the national park and preserve system, reestablishing government credibility after the Watergate crisis, and the Camp David Accords, which forged a peace between Egypt and Israel, like we talked about in this live stream. They were overshadowed by trouble at home and abroad. At home, Carter and his advisors, most of them Washington outsiders, met resistance from his own party. Then in November 1979, Iranian militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took hostages. He tried negotiation and launched a bold rescue mission that never reached its target because of helicopter failure. He could not resolve the situation until the last day of his administration. And then that crisis, the Iranian hostage crisis, really dealt a blow because the media, I was not old enough back then. I was 2 years old when that happened, but looking back at documentaries and film, the media was reporting it in the evening news like, oh, this is day one of the hostage crisis, day 2, day 3, day 4. And so they kept reporting that on and on and on, the evening news. So when you have a crisis like that and it keeps getting reported in mainstream media, in the nightly news, when all the adults are home watching the news. And back then, you only had you didn't have all these networks that you have today. You just had, the major networks pretty much, and cable news was just starting at the time. So those images really painted a picture of a White House that doesn't have a control of the situation, and that I think really hurt him a lot, and just reaffirmed to people that not everything was well during the Carter administration. And I think George Herbert Walker Bush, referred to as the malaise days of the Carter administration, if I'm not mistaken. So there it is. At home, a foundering economy exacerbated by oil embargoes. And that was another thing, too. And my folks talked about that, too, that there would be long lines in gasoline stations. But again, I think that stuff is not, he had no control over that. I believe that was more of a function of OPEC than anything that the president did at the time. OPEC being the oil, petroleum and exporting countries that are countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, or Iran. Those countries export oil. And and that organization kind of decides how much of the supply of oil gets into the world market and so forth. And so from the Middle East countries, and the rise of the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan helped lead to his defeat in November 1980. And Reagan was a governor of California, and he had been trying to become president since the 1960s. And there it is. So, and Carter returned to Tiny Plains and used the power of an ex-president's bully pulpit as a springboard to his last, and some say his best act. And then it just talks about his post-presidency there. And the other thing, too, that I did want to point out is that he did write a book. I have not read the book, though, but it's called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And I want to mention that in closing because he had I remember my memory of him, of Jimmy Carter, his post-presidency, one of the main highlights is when he wrote that book and then he was interviewed by Charlie Rose for PBS. And he had received a lot of like negative backlash, especially from the pro-Israel lobby. And I think he pointed out the AIPAC as well. I might be mistaken in the interview. So, and then he had talked about how the Palestinian people had been mistreated by Israel. And so, of course, the title of the book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And I remember that here in West LA, so I live in Los Angeles, there was a book signing in near UCLA on close to Westwood and Wilshire. And there used to be a border store south, like about 2 blocks south of Wilshire and Westwood. And Westwood runs north and south. And it was on Westwood Street. And I think I showed up on that day to that Borders bookstore. And actually I didn't even know that he was there for a book signing. But I think they allowed people in the bookstore, but then later they told people, okay, everybody needs to step out, leave. They give you like a certain time. And so there was already like a long line of people outside of the Borders bookstore waiting for him to come so that they could sign his so that he could autograph their copy of the book that they bought. But I do remember that he spoke out for the Palestinian people during his post-presidency. And so I mean I'm not really an expert in his presidency, but he did come across as more of a real Christian than any of these other presidents who claim to be Christian. He really kind of seemed to embody what Christianity is really supposed to be about. So it's really not supposed to be about oppressing people abroad. And I think that that's what he was trying to point out in his book. I haven't read the book, but it seemed like from the interviews that I heard from him promoting his book, it just seemed like he just felt that just oppressing people, if you look even the Bible stories, right? Oppressing people is a bad thing, right? And then when the evil kings oppress the people of God, and God thinks of these kings, these rulers, as doing evil in the sight of the Lord, right? And the prophets in the Old Testament, they're always fighting for the underdog. They're not fighting for the interest of the powerful. So he seemed to try to be a voice of that consciousness, whereas the Republican Party would do the opposite. They would try to promote Christianity to promote the interests of wealthy people and to use that religion to really oppress people. And that's really kind of what stands out to me as my memory of him. It seems from my study of his presidency, it was not really the good presidency. Even inside for the Democratic Party, to me it seems like his post-presidency was a highlight of his legacy. And the book Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid was one major highlight. And he created waves with that book. But yeah, so if you've just tuned in, Jimmy Carter, our 39th U.S. president, has passed away at the age of 100. This has been a PDR Live, reporting uncensored. Wait, what was it? It's unfiltered. I got to go back. Here, I wrote this down. It's uncut, unfiltered, uncensored. Something like that. Uncut, unfiltered, uncensored. I think that'll be the motto of the live streams. Uncut, unfiltered, uncensored. And so this has been a PDR Live. Please like our live stream and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for joining, and have a good evening.